Retro Quickies, a boy and his blob. When building a game that sort of goes against the grain when it comes to genre expectations, you always run the risk of alienating an audience when doing something a bit out of the ordinary. Nowadays, indie games are kind of a playground for this sort of thing, but throughout the history of games developed specifically for consoles, there have always been some interesting yet risky choices made. Like, for example, porting an RTS game over to the N64 of all things. Today's subject, A Boy and His Blob, developed by Imagineering and published by Absolute Entertainment in 1989, is one of those delightful little experiments that occasionally gets brought up, but not nearly as often as you would think. The game essentially wanted to be a point-and-click adventure game with a lot of the usual trappings of the genre, but with a design that would be more at home on the NES. Hence, it plays like an explorative puzzle platformer. You play as the eponymous boy, who has made friends with Blobbert, or just Blob. There's apparently a lot of bad stuff happening on his home planet of Bloblonia, and he needs your help to get back there and stop the evil emperor of the planet. To do that, you need to travel the map, collecting as much treasure as possible so that you can afford vitamins from the health store, which as it turns out are the Emperor's weakness. Then you can travel to Bloblonia via root beer rocket and free the planet from the clutches of the Emperor for good. It's a cute little story, though none of it is really conveyed via the game itself, which is very sparse on actual character and interaction, with pretty much all of the narrative elements of the game contained in the manual, which was fairly standard for a lot of games of this time period, and the ending. But still, there isn't even a text crawl to set the scene or anything, you just have to read the manual to figure out what's going on. The ending does sum things up well, at least, though before that, you're basically just left to your own devices. With that said though, what exactly do you need to do to play this game? Well, you can run around and your blob will diligently follow after you as best as it's able, though it definitely isn't as fast as you, and can oftentimes end up separated from you if you aren't careful. You have no jump and no real means of defending yourself without your blobby companion, and like most adventure games, it is very easy to die. You can't swim, falling any further than a single screen will result in a fall death. There are several bouncing enemies all over the place that are difficult to juke around. The world in general just seems very hostile to your presence, and that's before you get off of Earth. But the main gameplay gimmick is your little blob buddy. From the start of the game, you are equipped with a hearty helping of jelly beans of various amounts and flavors, and whenever you feed one to your blob, he'll take on the appearance and properties of a specific tool based on the flavor. And you have 14 different flavors to work with, but only a limited number of each. You can kind of guess how useful or prolific certain flavors are going to be based on the amount that you start with, but even so, you still have to be careful as there's no way in the game to get more jelly beans. So if you find yourself in a situation where you need a certain flavor and you toss them away while experimenting, well, sorry to say, but that's back to the start with you. The tools your blob turns into range from always useful, like ladders to climb up and down gaps, trampolines to reach out of the way areas above you, and holes to drop through solid platforms, to ones that you'll only be using a few times, like a hummingbird to let your blob follow you up to high areas, or a rocket that you'll use to get all the way to Bloblonia. But figuring out what flavor does what can be a bit annoying without a list or a guide. The game does try to give you hints via both puns and word association, but it's a bit inconsistent. For example, you have ones like tangerine and trampoline, or ladder and licorice, or vanilla and umbrella that rely on the words sounding kind of like the flavor. But then you have ones like cinnamon that turn you into a blowtorch, or apple that turns you into a car jack, which rely more on puns. The ketchup flavor is probably the worst of this because it causes your blob to instantly appear next to you if you use it, literally making it a catch-up mechanic. And then there are one or two that are just there. The coconut flavor just turns you into a coconut, no word association, no pun, it's just what it says it is. And orange makes you turn into the Vita Blaster, the closest thing you have to a weapon, which you use to fend off the hostile creatures found on Bloblonia, when you can afford the ammo for it, of course. Learning what each of these tools are associated with is one thing, but actually learning what they do and how to use them is another. Some are more obvious than others, like the ladder letting you move up and down from platform to platform. But others like the hummingbird and the cola bubble are more unusual, and it can be kind of head-scratching to figure out exactly what you're supposed to use them for. or if you need them at all. Some of them even have multiple uses, some that don't really make sense at first blush. The map you have to traverse is honestly pretty impressive, as it's basically only 2 maps in the whole game, one for Earth and another for Bloblonia, and both are pretty big and maze-like, involving you moving from screen to screen, kind of like an old Atari adventure game. The size of the map can be a problem, however, as you can't see a greater map of the area, and the only indicator that you have of how close you are to your goal is the treasure number near the top of the screen that shows you how many more you can possibly find in the whole game. And while the game is fairly generous with the amount of jelly beans that it gives you for the more commonly used tools, when you're first routing out the game, there is a chance, however small, that you'll run out of resources or lives while trying to get the lay of the land. More likely the latter, as you have a very quick start up to your movement, and you always carry a lot of momentum when you stop, so it's very easy to accidentally slide off the edge of a cliff or into an enemy. And if you die, the game's checkpoint system is strange, as it will usually send you back several screens from where you died, generally not far from the area in question, but sometimes in areas that you didn't pass through before. If you run out of lives, well, that's it, it's game over, and you go back to the start of your journey. Now, the game is actually fairly short when you know the route to take to grab the treasure, but it still stings to gather up a good chunk of all of it and have to start all over again. This isn't helped by the fact that you have to wrangle with an AI companion. While your blob is fairly decent at following you, it can be difficult to get it into the proper position for certain uses, like ladders and trampolines, as it tends to move in these full bounces rather than gentle steps. Thankfully, everything else working with the blob is fairly simple. You can feed it jelly beans from a good distance away, and even toss them off a cliff to the screen below if the blob is below you. He's also totally invincible and won't even react to most of the obstacles in your way, which is nice, so the game is far from an escort mission. If anything, he's the one trying to escort you around. The game also looks very simple, and doesn't have much in the way of music, but I think that might have more to do with its alleged intense development cycle, which might also explain its very bare-bones narrative segments as well. You basically have only one song throughout the entirety of the game, and it's a decently catchy tune, though it wears thin by the time the credits roll. And the little interstitials that will insert themselves during certain transformations or events are also pretty charming. The game was not terribly successful, but it did leave enough of an impression to get a sequel on the Game Boy, and a reimagining on the Wii back in 2009. While the overall gameplay can be very clunky and requires a lot of trial and error until you can fully memorize all of the tools you get from the jelly bean flavors, the actual idea behind its gameplay is very fun. You being a relatively helpless character who has to rely more on their cleverness, and the abilities of a secondary character that requires you to tell them how to use their tools and abilities. While this game in particular doesn't stick the landing with this idea, it is still an interesting curiosity, an attempt at bringing a more action-oriented and console-friendly way of playing what is essentially a traditional adventure game without mouse and keyboard. But it'd be a lot easier if we weren't rubbing butter on our shoes all the time.